Today, we're gonna look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please gift the like button a brand new puzzle, but don't tell them you've secretly removed 2 of the pieces. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Just before midnight on August 20th, 2012, a 19-year-old college student named Rose Marr and her best friend, 19-year-old Elizabeth Nass, walked down Main Street in their hometown of Ellicott City, Maryland. It was their last night together before they each would head back to college in separate states. And so to cap off what had felt like a perfect summer, they decided to grab a few beers, despite being underage, and head on over to their favorite hangout spot, a train trestle that ran over Main Street. A train trestle is literally a bridge, but for trains. Now, to be clear, this train trestle was not like some secret daredevil hideout spot. Lots of people knew about it. Lots of kids in town, including Rose and Elizabeth, had been up here many, many times. And while there was an active train track that ran across it, the ledge on the trestle where everybody would sit when they were up there was several feet away from the tracks, kind of safely out of the way. You could be up there looking down over the town, and a train could literally pass right by you and not affect you. So overall, it was safe. So Elizabeth and Rose climbed up onto the train trestle and took their seats along the ledge, safely away from the tracks. And then they cracked open a few beers and began talking about their upcoming semesters. They talked about which classes they were going to take and what they were looking forward to and really how much they were going to miss each other. And then at some point, Rose pulled out her phone and she took a photo of her and Elizabeth's feet dangling off the trestle. Basically, the photo captured their feet kind of hovering over Main Street. Then she posted that photo to Twitter, and then as soon as she hit post, she and Elizabeth heard this loud screeching sound coming from right behind them. And when they turned around to see what it was, something huge smashed into them, and then it went black. That loud screeching sound was the sound of a train passing by right behind them. But remember, the tracks are set far enough back that, the train, it couldn't hit them. And in this case, the train was not the thing that hit these 2 girls. Instead, it was something truly unfortunate that happened to them. When that train passed by the girls, it partially derailed. Not a full scale, like cars going everywhere off the tracks, but instead, several of these cars basically toppled over to their sides. And some of those cars that toppled over were carrying thousands of pounds of coal. And these were open cars. You can literally see the coal as the train goes by. And so as the train's going by, those cars topple, all this coal comes out, and the coal smashed into Rose and Elizabeth and fully buried them. It was like they were under an avalanche, but not of snow, of coal. And so by the time the girls were pulled out of the coal, they were already dead. Rose and Elizabeth were the only 2 fatalities from this derailment. Their families would later sue the railroad company alleging negligence, and each family would receive a settlement, though the exact amounts were never disclosed. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. June is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, and so in honor of that, I wanted to share a quick story about my own mental health. So back in 2017, I got out of the military after several years, and I really went through a sort of identity crisis. So much of who I was wrapped up in being a Navy SEAL, but now that I was out on the other side, it was like I didn't know who I was anymore, and I didn't even know what job to get or really what to do with my life. And it was sort of like this existential crisis that really sent me into a very dark and depressing spiral. But instead of seeking help or telling anybody about it, I began sort of lashing out at family and friends and just kind of being a downer everywhere I went. It wasn't until my family and friends, because they loved me, stepped in and said, "You really need to see someone," that I finally understood the impact I was having on other people and how bad things had gotten for me. And so I did go out and I spoke to a therapist. And at first, I admit, I wasn't sold that this was going to be a big solution for me. But pretty quickly, having that neutral third party to kind of bounce ideas off of and gain perspective from really changed my life, and it set me on a course to where I'm happy today. I still see a therapist, but it's therapy that got me to this place right now, this equilibrium I have reached. It's because of therapy. So if you're struggling right now, I would highly suggest thinking about therapy as an option. And a great starting point for therapy is BetterHelp. Primarily because it's entirely online, so it's very easy, it's accessible. All you have to do is fill out a quick survey online, and then within 2 days, they'll pair you up with a licensed therapist. And if for any reason you want to change your therapist, you can do that at any time at no additional cost. Click the link in the description below, or go to betterhelp.com/Mr. Ballen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Again, that's betterhelp.com/Mr. Ballen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Okay, back to the stories. At 6 p.m. on October 27, 2014, a 17-year-old boy named Jesus Meneses was playing basketball with a group of friends on an outdoor basketball court at Kinloch Park in Miami, Florida. The friends had broken up into 2 teams and were in the middle of a very intense pickup game. And the game was pretty close, and Jesus' team was doing pretty well. But at some point, when Jesus and his team had possession, one of his teammates just got frazzled by the defense and just took this crazy three-point shot from way behind the line, and the ball just sailed right past the hoop, completely missed it, air ball, and it bounced and then went clean over this chain link fence on the edge of the park. And as soon as this happened, Jesus and all of his friends let out a collective groan, because they knew basically anything that went over that fence was pretty much gone forever. But to Jesus' surprise, one of his friends turned to Jesus and was like, "Hey, why don't you just hop the fence and go get the ball?" Now, Jesus really did not want to do that. I mean, he had been coming to this park since he was like 1 year old with his family, and his mom and dad had always told him to never, ever climb that fence. Never. But now, Jesus' friend who had asked him to do this had kind of like turned it into a dare, and he's like, "No, really, come on, Jesus, like, go hop the fence and get the ball." And the other friends had kind of picked up on this, and they were kind of egging it on, being like, "Yeah, Jesus, go over there, get the ball." And so Jesus knew, like, this is not a good idea. I cannot go over that fence. But here I am, surrounded by all my peers, basically egging me on to go do it, and he didn't want to look weak or scared, and so he's thinking to himself, hey, what's the worst that could happen? And he's like, all right, I'll go get it. And so Jesus left the basketball court and walked over to this fence. And it was about 7 feet tall, and there was all this barbed wire across the top of it. And so as he's standing there looking at the fence, he turns back around, and his friends are all smiling like, "Yeah, go get it." And so he's like, okay. And he begins climbing the fence. And he gets to the top and he reaches the barbed wire, and he very carefully positions himself so he doesn't cut himself on the way over. And right after he's cleared the barbed wire, he kind of tumbles to the other side of the fence. He hits the ground, and he's kind of shaken up from hitting the ground pretty hard. But, he stands up, dusts himself off. He realizes he's okay, and he turns and looks through the fence now at his friends, and they're all cheering him on. And so now Jesus is feeling really confident, and he kind of smiles at his friends like he's the hero now. And he turns, and sure enough, there's the basketball, just a few feet away. So he walks over, picks up the basketball, and chucks it over the fence back to his friends. And Jesus was about to climb over the fence and go rejoin his friends when he happened to look back in the direction of where his basketball had been, and he noticed there was another basketball that somebody else had lost over this fence. Except this basketball was on the other side of a second fence. Basically, once you climb this first fence, a couple of feet later, there is a second fence. These were the 2 fences that Jesus and everybody who ever came to this park were warned about. Never climb them. But Jesus has already climbed the first one, and he's got his basketball, and he's thinking, I can climb the second one too, and I can get that basketball, and then we'll have 2. So if we ever lose another one, we have a backup. So without even telling his friends, Jesus walks over to the second fence, which is basically identical to the first fence, about 7 feet tall, a bunch of barbed wire at the top, and he carefully climbs to the top, and he kind of positions himself over the barbed wire, and then he drops down to the other side, except this time, when he hits the ground after clearing that second fence, something horrible happens. Within seconds of Jesus landing inside of that second fenced-in area, his friends back on the court saw what was going on and began totally panicking. They're screaming, they're running around, they don't know what to do. Eventually, one of them would call 911, and then minutes later, first responders show up and they find Jesus' friends. They're totally frantic. They're all pointing toward the fenced-in areas. And the first responders, they look and they know right away there's virtually nothing they can do to save Jesus. The reason these fences were totally off limits, the reason Jesus's family specifically warned him from when he was a young kid to never ever climb them, was because inside of the second fenced-in area was an electrical power grid. And there were signs all over these two fences warning people to stay back, that it was dangerous, no trespassing, like fatalities will occur if you go in here. But Jesus ignored the warnings, and he climbed the first fence, and he climbed the second fence. Except when he landed inside of that second fenced-in area, he landed on a live electrical wire. And the second he did, 500,000 volts of electricity coursed through his body. For reference, the average lightning bolt contains about 300,000 volts of electricity. So as soon as Jesus hit that wire, it was like the equivalent of 2 lightning bolts striking him at once, but not just one time, over and over and over again. And so unfortunately, Jesus died almost immediately. On the afternoon of April 22nd, 2023, a 49-year-old father of 3 named Carl O'Keefe crawled through a cave system in Cumbria, England. He was on his hands and knees shuffling his way forward, and the only light that guided him through this tight, small tunnel was the headlamp on his head. So Carl was an adventurer. He loved things like rock climbing and exploring caves, but this particular cave he wasn't that familiar with. He'd only been here a couple other times, and he didn't have a map, so really he didn't actually know where he was going. But Carl wasn't remotely worried, because he knew this was easily the safest cave system he had ever explored. In fact, this place was so safe that often people showed up with their kids and let them run around freely with no fear they were going to get hurt. And so Carl has no worries here. And also he's thinking to himself, he's not very far into this particular tunnel. He can actually still hear the other people and their kids kind of right behind him. And so again, even though he doesn't really know where he is, he feels completely fine. And so Carl continued crawling through this tunnel, and eventually he reached this T intersection where he just had to choose between going right and left. And again, he's got no map. He doesn't really know where he's going. So he decides, okay, I'll just go right. And so he begins going down this tunnel, which closely resembled the tunnel he had just came from. But as he was crawling along, he started to feel like the walls around him were kind of shrinking, and it was getting harder and harder to push his body through this tunnel. And then finally, when it felt like it was so tight around him and it was getting so claustrophobic that maybe he should just turn around, he reached a dead end. That's all this was. The right turn was just a dead end. And so he thought, okay, I'll just turn around and go back the way I came and, maybe explore the left side. So in order to do that, Carl decided he would make a U-turn with his body. He would literally just turn around and go back the way he came, leading with his head and his upper body. And so he's facing the dead end. He's on his hands and knees, and he begins doing this U-turn. And he kind of turns and gets his head and his shoulders and his upper half kind of folded around until they're looking back in the direction he was coming. But he was too physically big to get his lower half to complete the U-turn. And so he was effectively wedged in this U-shaped position. He couldn't do anything. He was just stuck. But Carl didn't panic, because he knows this is a safe place. This is not a big deal. Nobody gets hurt in these cave systems, and I just need to rethink how I go back the way I came. Clearly, this U-turn attempt is not working. And so he decides, okay, let's reset. I'll pull my shoulders and my upper body back, and I'll reset facing the dead end. I'll basically go back to exactly the position I was just in. Except when he tried pulling his upper body and his head and his shoulders back to where he was facing the dead end, he realized he was also stuck going in that direction. He couldn't go back to the way he was, and he couldn't return in the direction he had come. He was stuck in this U-shape and couldn't go anywhere. Now, again, Carl is telling himself that it's gonna be okay. This is a safe place. Kids play here. Like, this is no big deal. I'm gonna be okay. And so he tried, to kind of shimmy himself one way or the other, but it was like no matter what he did, he just could not move out of this U-shape. And as that happened, he began to kind of panic. His heart rate began to rise. It became harder to breathe. It felt like the walls of this cave were kind of pushing down on him. And before long, he was becoming overwhelmingly claustrophobic. It just felt like the walls of this tunnel were crushing him, and he really began to panic, and he just started screaming out for help. Immediately, some of the staff who heard Carl yelling out made their way into this tunnel system and actually saw Carl. They could see him in this U-shape, totally wedged. And at first they couldn't understand what was even happening here. But when they tried to pull him out, they couldn't get him to move. I mean, he really was totally stuck here. And so sensing that this was a true emergency, the staff backed out and they called the fire department. And the fire department, they came out and they too could not get Carl out. He was stuck. And so pretty quickly, Carl realized all he could do here was just do his best to stay calm, because this position he was in was really restricting his breathing, not to mention, the tunnel itself is pressing down on him. And so he just tried to stay calm and kind of have measured breaths. And he kept thinking, the rescue team, they're right there. They're gonna get me out of here quickly, I know it. But much to Carl's shock, and to the shock of all the first responders, they didn't get Carl out quickly. Instead, it would take an agonizing 4 hours to finally free him. And during those 4 hours, Carl got weaker and weaker and weaker and more panicked. The instant Carl was out of the tunnel, he was rushed to the nearest hospital and admitted to the intensive care unit. And there, they would discover he had suffered all these extensive crush injuries from being in that position for so long. He had severe bone damage, organ damage, and nerve damage. I mean, he was in horrible shape. And despite heroic efforts by medical staff to try to save Carl, ultimately, he would die 8 days later from those injuries. And his death would become massive news, because it really seemed impossible that somebody could die in that cave system, because it was meant to be so safe. This cave system was not like an underground cave system where spelunkers go. No, this was a cave system for kids. It was a kids' play place. All the tunnels in the cave itself was made out of plastic, again, so kids could crawl and explore. But adults were told they too could go through those tunnels with their kids. And so Carl had gone to a birthday party for one of his kids' friends. He had brought his kids along, and being the devoted father that he was, he went right in there with his kids and was crawling all around and goofing around with the kids until, unfortunately, he got stuck. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, Mr. Ballen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm gonna share 3 stories about people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a nice high-end teeth whitening kit, but don't tell them you've secretly replaced the whitener with red hair dye. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, 1967, a 17-year-old girl named Nancy McEwen was driving along a highway in Brooklyn, New York. She was on her way to her job as a secretary at her dad's office in Brooklyn, and she was coming from her home in Long Island, New York. Now, the commute to her office took about an hour, but Nancy didn't mind, because her dad had just got her this beautiful brand new yellow Camaro, and she loved driving it. And the highway she was on had this amazing view of the beach and ocean down below. And so that day, Nancy rolled down her window so she could feel the ocean breeze as she drove, and then she took in a deep breath and she smiled. At the same time Nancy was doing this, a police lieutenant was driving in his car a couple cars back from Nancy, and as he was just driving along, he suddenly sees this yellow Camaro that to this point had been driving completely normally, suddenly veer off the road, miraculously missed the oncoming cars, and then smashed into a tree on the side of the road. And so the police lieutenant instinctively jammed on his brakes and veered over to the shoulder and stopped behind the Camaro. And as the lieutenant got out of the car, he was thinking clearly the driver must have just had some kind of medical emergency because he didn't see any obstacles in the road and, the car, the Camaro, had been driving completely normally to that point. So what would cause them to veer and crash into the road at such a high speed other than a medical emergency? And so the lieutenant jumps out of the car, runs over to the driver's side window, and he looks inside and he sees this teenage girl, this blonde teenage girl, and she's slumped over the wheel. And she's not looking up at him, she's not making any sound, she's just sitting there. And so he opens up the door and he asks her, are you okay? And she didn't say anything, but she did moan. And so she was breathing, she was alive, and there weren't any obvious physical injuries. Clearly she's just crashed into this tree at high speed, so she's definitely shaken up. But there weren't any obvious grievous injuries that have occurred here, at least none that he could see. And so he asked her again, hey, are you okay? What's going on here? And she just continued to moan. And so again, considering he's looking at her and she seems, basically okay, all things considered, he thought, maybe she's drunk. That would kind of explain, the sudden veering off the road. And so at this point, the lieutenant radioed for backup and also called for an ambulance. And while he waited, he began searching the car, just basically looking to see if maybe there was some clue in the car as to what happened here. For example, containers of alcohol. And so he's looking around and he doesn't see any empty bottles and he can't smell any alcohol in the car. But still, this whole time, the girl is not responding. She's just moaning and just kind of slumped over there. And then a couple of minutes later, he hears sirens and he looks up and a bunch of first responders came over. They pulled the girl out of the car, got her in the ambulance, and off to the hospital she went. Once Nancy got to the hospital, medical staff was able to determine that she was not drunk, but she did clearly appear to be having some kind of medical emergency. But they didn't know what it was. And again, there was no visible injuries on her. She just basically looked really shaken up and was non-responsive. And quickly, after Nancy was at the hospital, her condition only got worse, to the point where doctors were giving her shots of adrenaline to try to keep her alive. But it didn't work. And at 11:30 a.m., roughly 2.5 hours after Nancy crashed into the tree, she died. And it was only then, after Nancy was dead, that the medical staff made a discovery, something they had totally missed when Nancy had first came in. And that was, on the back of her head, hidden amongst her hair, was a small circular hole. It was a bullet wound, and for some reason, it didn't bleed at all. Clearly, Nancy did not just randomly veer off the road and smash into a tree. No, she had been shot. About 30 minutes after this discovery was made, a detective named Albert Seidman was standing next to Nancy's crashed car on the side of the highway. Seidman had a reputation as being this totally no-nonsense detective who effectively would stop at nothing to try to solve a case. By this point, he'd already spoken to Nancy's parents, who obviously were devastated and very confused by their daughter's death. They said that, Nancy never got in trouble and certainly didn't have any enemies, and so it made no sense that somebody had just shot her as she was driving. And Detective Seidman had to agree. This was not an average murder case. But regardless, he knew the best place to start this investigation was Nancy's car. The car was actually in pretty good shape. Despite striking this tree at high speeds, the body of the car basically remained intact. And so Seidman began going inside the car and looking all around it, looking for bullet holes to see where this bullet came in and struck the driver. But he found none. Really, there was nothing in the car that gave any information away about what actually happened here. Also, adding to the mystery here is Seidman knew there had been that police lieutenant who just happened to be driving a few cars back from Nancy when she suddenly veered off the road and crashed. And he would say that he did not hear any gunshots, although admittedly he wasn't really listening for gunshots, but he said everything was normal and then the car just veered and crashed. He couldn't understand it. Detective Seidman had briefly considered that, maybe Nancy had been shot by somebody inside of her car. But because of the presence of that lieutenant, who immediately was on the scene and was basically looking at the car from the time it crashed all the way until the ambulance arrived, he said there was nobody else in the car and I did not witness anybody fleeing the scene. The whole situation was very bizarre. But Detective Seidman, thinking logically, thought, okay, well, we know she's been shot. So even though nobody knows how that happened, Well, there has to be a shell casing somewhere for the round that struck her. And so for the rest of the day, Seidman and his team canvassed that whole highway all around that area looking for a shell casing, or really any clue that a gun had been fired in the vicinity. But they found nothing. By the end of the day, Detective Seidman was beginning to feel pretty disappointed about how the investigation was going so far. But he thought to himself, okay, well, I know I haven't found anything promising yet. But remember, she was shot not in some secluded area. She was shot on a major highway in Brooklyn, New York, a city of over 2.5 million people. I mean, someone somewhere must have seen or heard something. And so instead of continuing to look for a shell casing, Seidman abandoned that idea and decided to go find witnesses. Over the next 5 days, Detective Seidman and his team scoured Brooklyn and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, looking for anybody who had any information about this shooting. They also put out a public plea for information and were fielding tips that way. But at the end of those 5 days, despite the huge number of interviews, they really hadn't gotten anywhere. As Seidman began to feel his frustration rising, because once again, it just felt like they were hitting another dead end on this case, he told himself, like, they must have missed something. They've talked to a ton of people, but maybe they were too quick. Maybe they weren't asking the right questions. And so on July 12th, he gathered up his team and he circled some spots on a map of Brooklyn and said, look guys, we're gonna go back to these key areas that are sort of positioned in the best angles to have maybe heard or seen something with the shooting. And we're gonna ask some more questions and just see if maybe these people have something we didn't catch. In one of those circled areas, the police discovered a gas station that was owned by a guy named Theodore DeLisi, and it was located only 2 blocks away from where Nancy had been shot. And on the morning of July 12th, when the police officers rolled up to this gas station, Theodore was working and he saw the police coming towards him, and right away he knew this had to be about Nancy McEwen. So Theodore had been following this case really closely as it was developing for 2 reasons. One, Nancy had been shot really close to his gas station, so there's that proximity bias. And 2, Theodore was actually friends with Nancy's father and had known Nancy growing up. And so this case really hit close to home. When the police walked inside the gas station, Theodore immediately asked them, "Are you here about Nancy?" And they would say yes. And that's when he would tell them his connection to Nancy and how he was following this case really closely. But despite his proximity to where she had been shot, he said unfortunately he hadn't seen or heard anything. But then Theodore quickly followed that up and said that, well, while he had been at the gas station in the morning for a little bit, he did take off at some point to go fishing out on the water in his boat, which was not too far away. But even from there too, he still said he didn't hear or see anything. But it was kind of noisy out on the water anyways, so, he really wouldn't have heard anything out there anyhow. The police nodded and asked some simple follow-up questions to Theodore about, take us through what happened that morning, what'd you see, were there other fishermen out there, when you were at the gas station, did you see anything unusual, just kind of seeing if there was anything that would jog his memory. And Theodore was answering every question as truthfully as he could, and at some point, he began to think really hard about what he actually saw when he was out on the water fishing. And suddenly, it all clicked. Theodore knew who killed Nancy. It would turn out at 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, the exact moment Nancy was shot, veered off the road and crashed, Theodore was in fact out in his boat fishing. Except at 8:40 a.m., he wasn't actually fishing. Instead, he had a can, and he threw that can into the water. And once he saw the can, he kind of kept staring at it, and then he raised his rifle and he fired a shot at the can. But he missed, and the bullet, by some fluke of physics, ricocheted off the surface of the water, went up into the highway right as Nancy had rolled her window down, struck her in the head, and killed her. Theodore knew he had been shooting his gun out on the water, but what he saw was the bullet hit the water. He didn't think for a second he could have fired up towards the highway. It was when police began asking questions that he thought, oh my goodness, it is possible a ricochet could have struck her in the head. Theodore was charged with homicide, but ultimately a grand jury chose not to indict him, citing that this truly was an accident. Theodore did not serve any jail time, but he was fined $100 for firing a rifle within city limits. Hey guys! Did you know you can get your strange, dark, and mysterious fix anytime, anywhere with the Mr. Ballen podcast on Amazon Music? Well, you can. There are tons of stories waiting to be binged right now, plus there are exclusive stories on there that have never been shared on this YouTube channel. Amazon Music listeners get to listen to new episodes an entire month before everybody else. You can also listen to my other show, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, 2 weeks early and totally ad-free on Amazon Music. If you're already a Prime member, well, you already have access to those 2 shows, plus hundreds of other top podcasts ad-free, all at no extra cost. That's right, your Prime membership includes Amazon Music absolutely free. So if you're ready to dive deeper into strange, dark, and mysterious stories, well, go download the Amazon Music app today and listen to the Mr. Ballen podcast and also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. Now, back to today's stories. On the evening of September 17, 2021, a 42-year-old preacher named Jason Thornburg was cleaning up his motel room in Euless, Texas, which is a small city between Dallas and Fort Worth. Jason was going to be hosting a small Bible study group in his motel room in a few minutes, and even though really it was not that dirty, he was really taking time to ensure it was as clean and inviting as he could possibly make it. So normally, Jason would host these Bible study groups at his house. But unfortunately, Jason's house burned down just that past summer, and he lost everything. But Jason was so committed to God and spreading the word of God that he still wanted to continue having these Bible study groups, even if it meant, doing it in this kind of crummy motel room. And so Jason walked around the room, picking up laundry and straightening up his bed. And then after kind of arranging chairs in a circle for the various participants he was expecting, he went over to a cabinet, pulled out some Bibles, and right as he was about to start placing these Bibles on each chair, he heard a knock at the door. And Jason was really excited because he knew that had to be someone who was here for this Bible study. And so he walked right over, Bibles in hand, to the door. He opened it up, and standing outside the door was this big guy covered in tattoos, kind of looking down at Jason. And Jason broke into a big smile. He was so happy to see this guy. The man's name was David Luaris. And Jason had previously met him when he was out on the street doing outreach for his church, and he had invited David to, anytime he wanted to come by the motel and be a part of this Bible study group. Now, Jason knew that David was really not the kind of guy who went to church or really showed any real interest in God or, the Bible, but, Jason took all kinds, and he was just hopeful that maybe David would show up someday. And now, here David was. However, David told Jason that the reason he was here was actually not for the Bible study group. He was here because he was in the middle of a crisis and he didn't know where else to turn. He confessed to Jason that he had begun using drugs and gotten mixed up in some criminal activity, and there's some dangerous people out there that he was sort of running with, and now his concern was some of those dangerous people were coming to get him. And so he literally felt like his life was in danger. Now, when Jason heard this, he was surprised. But at the same time, he could tell that David was being very authentic and just needed help. And Jason felt like, his job ultimately was to serve God and all of God's people. And David was one of those people, and he was in need of help. And so if all Jason did was simply provided safe haven for David inside of this motel room, then that was serving God and it was the right thing to do. And so Jason immediately said, "No problem, David." He handed him a Bible and said, "Come on in." David took the Bible awkwardly and just kind of stood there for a moment, not really sure what to do. But then Jason said, "Hey, relax, just come inside, take a seat." And so David did. He walked in, he sat down with the Bible, and then Jason actually came over and sat down next to him, and the two of them, for about 15 minutes, just made kind of awkward small talk. Jason could tell, David is completely on edge. He was staring at the door, which was now closed, and he just clearly was very anxious and paranoid. And so Jason really wasn't talking about the Bible or God or anything. He was just, trying to calm David down and show him that this was a safe place. And then after about 15 minutes of this, when David had somewhat calmed down, and also by this point, nobody else had showed up for this Bible study group, Jason decided, okay, you know what? Maybe I'll just begin the Bible study with David. It kind of gives us something to do. And so Jason got up, he locked the door, showing David that it's just going to be them, it's safe here. And he told David to go ahead and open his Bible to a certain page. And then the two of them just began reading the Bible together. And for hours, they just sat there reading the Bible, and Jason spoke to David about, teachings of God and how to lead your life in a way to serve other people. And, for the most part, David did completely calm down and seemed to really be embracing this Bible study. But eventually, despite how well this Bible study was going, It did need to come to an end at some point, at least in Jason's mind. And when he began to notice it was getting dark outside, he sort of began wrapping it up, and he shut his Bible and sort of expected that David would take a hint and leave, but David didn't. Instead, when David began to realize that, hey, this is over now and it's time for you to go, David looked at Jason and begged him to please let him stay in this room overnight, that he can't go out there, it's not safe for him. Now, Jason knew he did have some level of responsibility for David. I mean, David had told him he was in danger, he had already invited him inside and was basically providing safe haven for him, and it did feel kind of wrong to be like, now go back out there, but at the same time, Jason felt a little uneasy. I mean, he didn't really know David. He didn't really understand the situation. And so there was some hesitation at first, but after looking again at David and seeing how desperate he was to just please stay here overnight, Jason said, okay, you can stay. So Jason grabbed some extra blankets and pillows and created a makeshift bed on the floor. And then after that, the two of them actually reopened their Bibles and just began reading some more from the Bible for a couple more hours, basically another round of Bible study. But eventually, they both were very tired, so they put their Bibles down, they said goodnight, they each climbed into their beds, and they closed their eyes and fell asleep. For the next 5 days, Jason's motel room remained mostly closed, and the only thing anybody heard coming from his room was gospel music. And it was being played at a very high volume, basically the entire time, to the point where other residents of this motel began to complain about how loud the music was. However, the owner of the motel was getting these complaints from residents who were only there for, hours at a time or days at a time. And, the room they're complaining about, Jason's room, he was a long-term resident and so had a sort of higher priority with the owner. And so the owner just didn't feel like bothering Jason. He wanted him to stay and keep paying for that room. And so the owner didn't do anything about the noise complaints. And also, the owner did know that his motel had sort of a seedy reputation, and so, generally speaking, he didn't really care too much about the music to begin with. And so over the course of these 5 days, the music kept on blasting, and really the only other thing of note, again, that happened in this period of time, was that these two other people entered Jason's motel room and didn't leave either. So basically there's 4 people in the room, they haven't come out again, super loud music, that's all going on for 5 days. And then on the 5th day, the morning of September 22nd, a single person walked out of Jason's motel room, and they were wearing a full-body hazmat suit and carrying some sort of luggage. And they would leave the motel, get in a car, and drive away. 45 minutes later, about 25 miles away from that motel, the Fort Worth Fire Department got a call about this raging dumpster fire in a residential neighborhood. Firefighters quickly got to the scene and put out the blaze, and after it was gone, they walked up to the smoky dumpster and looked inside just to get a look at what was burning, and what they saw caused them all to back up and call the police. It would turn out David was right when he said he was in danger. However, what he didn't understand is hiding out in Jason's motel room was not going to protect him from that danger. Shortly after he and Jason wrapped up that second Bible study that night, and the two of them climbed into their respective beds, Jason in his actual bed and David in the makeshift bed on the floor, well, David did fall asleep pretty quickly, but Jason didn't. Jason waited until David was asleep, and then Jason got up, got a knife, and then slit David's throat. Then he cut David's heart out and ate it, because Jason the preacher really actually believed that human sacrifice was the best and purest way to serve God. Over the course of the next 5 days after killing David, Jason would remain in his motel room blasting gospel music, and over those 5 days, he would basically lure those 2 women into his room, very likely on the promise of Bible study, but they too would be sacrificed. And then on the 5th day, the person who exited the motel room in the full hazmat suit was Jason, and that luggage he was carrying with him contained the body parts of the 3 people he had just killed. And he brought those body parts to that dumpster in that residential neighborhood and lit them on fire. And so when the firefighters put out the fire, what they saw inside were burned up bodies. Jason was arrested, and while he was awaiting trial, he confessed that David and the 2 women were not actually his first victims. He said that just a few years earlier, he had sacrificed his girlfriend, and that house fire that destroyed all of his belongings and prompted him to go live in this motel was set by Jason himself. because he had sacrificed his roommate and needed to get rid of the evidence. Ultimately, law enforcement was only able to show that Jason killed those 5 people. But there could have been more. Jason was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Texas. On the evening of Thursday, May 21st, 2015, a 16-year-old girl named Lily walked into the home gym inside of her house in Hong Kong looking to do a workout. Now, she sort of expected the gym would be empty and she could kind of have the run of the place, but as soon as she walked in, she saw her dad was in there and he was doing some sort of cool-down exercise on a yoga ball. So Lily's dad, whose name was Ka Kim Sun, was a doctor and a professional, and normally at this time of the day, she would never see him in the gym. He was typically locked upstairs in his study, or upstairs doing work or something, or he was just gone for the day. So for him to be here, it just didn't really line up with his schedule. And so Lily asked her dad, what are you doing here? What's going on? And her dad would tell her, well, actually, work at the hospital was really slow today, so I took off, I played some tennis with friends, and now I'm just doing some cool down exercises because I got nothing else to do. But I'll be out of your hair in a second. And sure enough, a couple of minutes later, her dad was up and out of the gym, and Lily just began her workout. The next day, May 22nd, around 1 o'clock, Lily was at home at her dining room table, sitting across from her mother, whose name was Wong Siu Fing, and Lily was eating a snack and staring at an open textbook. Now, normally at 1 o'clock on a Friday, Lily would be at school, but she had the day off that day. And she had wanted to spend her day off seeing friends and just being a teenager, but her dad was really focused on her being successful academically, and he told her that absolutely not. You're not going anywhere. You are going to stay home and you are going to study all day long. You will not leave the house. That's what you're doing. So Lily just continued to stare at the textbook and basically do what her father said. And then a couple of minutes later, she actually heard her dad coming down the stairs, and he came into the dining room, and he was clearly very pleased to see his daughter doing her work, or at least appearing to do her work. And he came over to her, gave her a kiss, he kissed their mother, and then he said he was off to work. And then he went out the door and he was gone. And as soon as Ka was gone, Lily's mom looked over at her and said, I'm not gonna make you study all day. Come on, let's go out and have a mother-daughter shopping day. And Lily was stoked. She shut her textbook, she went and got ready, and then a minute later, she and her mom climbed into her mom's yellow Mini Cooper car and they headed out. About 2 hours later, around 4:15 p.m., a local jogger was running in the same neighborhood as where Lily and her family lived, and as they were running down the road, they noticed there was this yellow Mini Cooper car sitting on the side of the road, not moving, but it was still on. It was just sort of idling right there. And at first glance, it appeared there were people inside the car, but they weren't doing anything. They were just sitting there, not moving. And so the jogger was curious, and so they ran past and made a point to look inside the car, and they saw 2 women in the front 2 seats of this car slumped over. The 2 women were Lily and her mother. And so the jogger began to panic and banged on the glass to try to get the women to respond, but they didn't. And so a minute later, police were called. They dragged Lily and her mother out of the car. They were totally unresponsive. They were rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. They both died. The police would begin their investigation into their deaths by searching the yellow Mini Cooper car. And when they searched it, there really was nothing of note inside of it. I mean, the 2 women's purses were in the front of the car, there was some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, but the car was pristine, clean, not cluttered. I mean, there really was nothing in the car that gave away what could have happened to these 2 women. For the next 6 months, the police tirelessly looked for some lead as to what happened to this mother and daughter. They would interview all their friends and family. They would search their house top to bottom. They would basically take apart this Mini Cooper and look for, defects or flaws that maybe could have contributed to their death. I mean, they were looking everywhere, but it just didn't make sense. Nobody had any idea what happened to these 2 women. And so right as this case appeared like it was about to go cold, the detectives decided to just go back to the Mini Cooper and see if maybe, just maybe, they missed something. And sure enough, they had. It would turn out on May 22nd, 2015, the day that Lily and her mother died, Lily's father had told Lily to stay home and study, not because he cared about her academics. I mean, he did, but that day, the reason for this was not for that. Instead, he wanted her to stay home all day to protect her. When police originally searched Lily's mom's car, they found the 2 women's purses and also some basic exercise equipment in the trunk. specifically a deflated yoga ball. And at the time, the police didn't think anything of these items. They looked into them, they considered them, but they didn't seem to have any bearing on what happened to the women. However, it would turn out the yoga ball did have something to do with it. Specifically, 2 days before the women were found dead, that yoga ball was inside of Lily's home. It was in her home gym. In fact, when she walked into the home gym and saw her dad doing cool-down exercises and thought it was strange he was home right now, he was using that yoga ball. And Lily didn't think anything of it. But in reality, what her father was doing was not cool-down exercises. He had not just come home early and, had played tennis and this and that. In reality, he had taken that yoga ball to the hospital where he worked and filled it with carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless, poisonous gas. And his plan was to put the yoga ball in his wife's car, unplug it, and now it's sealed and the gas is going to leak inside the car. And then when his wife got in the car and shut the door, she would effectively suffocate and die. He didn't try to kill his daughter, though. He wanted her to stay home and study, i.e., don't go with your mom and get in the car. But the mother defied the father, brought the daughter along, and then after driving for only a mile, the two women collapsed and died. Ka Kim-sun was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He has never explained his motive. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, Mr. Ballen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
এত পূর্ণ আমি কোন সময় উঠছিলাম বলে আল্লাহ তোমার মতো একটা মানুষ আমাকে কি লিখে দিব দেন চেক করে দেন আল্লাহ চেক করে দেন
আল্লাহ গো এইটা আমাগো ছাগল আল্লাহ এইবার এই ছাগল দিয়ে আমরা কুরবানি দিব
ভাত খেয়ে যায়
না না খাওয়ান লাগবো না আমি যে বাড়িতে না ভাত তরকারি রাইন দিয়েছি
উট কুরবানিতে ঢাকানো লাগবো এখন ইন্টারনেটের যুগ ফেসবুকে ছবি দেখো
জুতো নাই থাকলে জুতো দিয়ে পিটাইতাম চলেন আসেন
হ্যাঁ এরম ফুটানি মাইরাই বেড়ায় দুনিয়া দাঁড় দানা করছে কিরে খাড়াই রেছিস কেন খাওয়ান দিছি তো খাইতে আয়
দিন আর দিনে খসিয়া পড়িবে। হুজুর নামাজ দিতেছেন? আপনার টুপির থেকে আমার টুপির দাম বেশি, বদলাইবেন?
খুবই স্পেশাল হয়েছে,
হ্যাঁ,
আসলেই মজা হয়েছে। খালি লবণটা দিতে ভুলে গেছিলাম।
আমি আবার অপোজিট পছন্দ করি না।
এইটাই তো ভালো।
দিন আর দিনে খসিয়া পড়িবে। চেষ্টাটা যে করতে পারছি, সন্তান হয়ে বাপের চিকিৎসা যে করাইতে পারছি, এটাই শান্তি।
হ্যাঁ, রান্ধনের হাত খারাপ হইলেও মানে ঝামেলা থাকলেও খাসির মাংসটা ভালো রান্ধে। ভাবি যান, আইসেন।
তুই তো বড় বেহায়া রে, তুই তো এরকমের ছিলি না, তুই তো দিয়ে আমার গুনার বাকি করবি।
দান খয়রাত নিতে আমি পারবো না, আমার শরম করে।
আরে বাবা, শরমের কি আছে?
আয় পায়েস খাওয়া যাবি।
ও না, পরে মনে হন যাই।
আইস কিন্তু
অনেক মানুষ আছে না, আশের মতন ক্যাত ক্যাত করে গলা পর্যন্ত খায়, আমি পারি না। গরিবের বউ না তুমি, খাসি মাংস খাইতে পারতাছি না, 1 ঘন্টা ঘুরে আনি।
একটু হাসো, ফ্রি ফ্রি ছাগল পাইতাছো, সুইট করে হাসি দাও। ছেগাইয়া হাসতেছো কেন? একটু সুইট করে হাসো।
ও ভাবি, এত স্বাদের মাংস ফালাই দিলেন কেন? খাসির মাংস আমি আনতে কইছিলাম আপনার লইগা, ভাবছিলাম মজা করে আপনারা রান্না খাওয়াবো।
কোন রঙে বানায়াছ ঘর খানি।
walked away. Fast Sava was bristling, ready to fight. Your Grace, Darian is such an asshole. You're always sending him gifts, and he takes them all. You show him you like him, and he doesn't turn you down, gives you just enough to keep you in